I've had a lot of time recently to go back through my back catalogue of images, and I found a couple of real gems there. But not only that, looking back at images that I shot 6-7 years ago, it's interesting to see what I've learned since then, and even looking at those images can actually help to reinforce that learning process. So in this video I was going to look at 4 images that I shot quite a while ago, look at what I've learned since then, what I can learn from looking at those images, and just see if through some clever post-processing I can make those images better than they are right now. I hope you'll enjoy the video. If you do and you're not already a subscriber, please consider hitting subscribe. And if you are a subscriber, thank you very much, I appreciate that. Okay, so this is my first image. This was shot in 2013 in Bonaire. Now this was when I was shooting with my first DSLR, which was a Nikon D5000, and all I had with me was the 18-105 lens, and that's what this image was shot with. This is the raw file. It's been completely unedited other than the profile corrections in here. If I bring it up onto full screen, the mistake that I've made here is I got completely focused on the position of the horizon line and the rule of thirds. So what I've done is I've got that horizon line on the rule of thirds, or on the bottom third position, but what that's done is left me with a whole load of empty space here in the foreground. I have got a nice sky. There's the sun setting just through the clouds there. The boats are quite nice, but compositionally it's challenged by that fact. And the lesson that I've learned here is not to get too bogged down in that rule of thirds, because if I had changed my perspective slightly, maybe I would have ended up with the horizon lower or higher, but I might have had a stronger composition. I'm going to see if I can do something with this quickly in post-processing. So let me just bring my information back up. And the first thing I'm going to do is crop it. So I'm going to bring it in as a 16:9 crop, and bring those boats a lot closer into the foreground. I'm going to just drop the exposure and boost the contrast a bit in the sky, maybe pull the highlights back, bring the shadows up, and add a touch of saturation. And I'm also going to take a little bit of green out by just shifting the colour temperature over there a bit, and then I'm going to put another one into the bottom part of the frame, and I'm going to lift the exposure a little bit, take a bit more green out, maybe put a bit more yellow in, touch of saturation, and maybe just bring the exposure up a little bit more, but bring the highlights back and lift the shadows a bit, just put more detail into the boats. And then I'm going to go into the basics tab and put in some vibrance, quite a bit. It's quite a vibrant scene, and maybe a touch of saturation, and that actually looks a lot better. It's still not an award-winning shot, it's still not going to make it into my portfolio. Looks like there might be a couple of dust spots in there that need to be dealt with. Maybe one there and one there. And maybe we should put in a bit more contrast in there. No, that's too much, don't like it. Maybe just a little bit more closing contrast in the sky. So just bring the exposure down a fraction there, and then a bit into the foreground. Bring the exposure down a fraction, maybe dial in a little bit of clarity there. Okay, that's not too bad. Let's move on to the next image. The second image was shot early in 2013, I think it was about March 2013, at Rutland Water, and this is Normanton Church. And there's two major lessons about this image, and the first one is to keep the attention on the main subject. My main subject is the church and the reflections of the church in the water, but I was getting fixated on having this swan as my foreground interest, and of course the swan was moving around, so I kept changing compositions to try to get the swan in the right place. And what's actually happened here is I've kind of got the swan in the right place, although it's a bit too far over to the left of the frame. But in doing so, I've shifted my main subject right up into the corner of the image, and it's just got no breathing space around it. It looks like it's trying to escape out of the frame. So the first lesson is keep an eye on that main subject. Doesn't help to get the foreground interest right if your main subject is in the wrong place. And to be honest, even then the swan is a little bit too far over to the left. The second lesson on this one has got nothing to do with the actual photography piece, but it has to do with storage and backup of your files, because I can't find my original RAW file for this image. What I've got is just this edited copy, and that limits what I can do to it, because I'm actually not keen on the way this has been processed. And if I had the original RAW file, I might consider going in and reprocessing it, putting it into Photoshop and using something like the content aware crop to expand the image, maybe on both sides and the top, to put a bit more breathing space around the swan, and particularly around this lovely church. But I don't have that original RAW file, so I don't think it's worth doing. Now this was shot in 2013 in November in the Lake District. Okay, so there's actually three lessons on this one, and the first lesson is I wasn't checking my edges closely enough when I shot this, and this bush on the right hand side of the frame here is really distracting and annoying. The second lesson is I should have got lower down, because there's just too much water here, too much empty space. If I'd got lower down, I'd have made more of a feature of this puddle in the foreground, and this tree bush here would have extended up a bit further this way, and that would have just balanced the image a lot better. The third lesson is to do with focus. Back then I used to use the focus 1/3 of the way in rule, and that's what I did on this one. I'm pretty sure I would have focused on probably on this bush, because that's about 1/3 of the way into the frame. And if I zoom all the way in, you can see, wait for it to put it into develop module because it will load faster. Yeah, I mean that bush is completely sharp, but the background is a little bit soft, and that sometimes happens when you focus 1/3 of the way in. The foreground is pretty sharp, but even then, right at the edges, it might be just a fraction soft. And that's one of the reasons why I don't use that focusing 1/3 of the way in approach anymore, because it so often ends up with a slightly soft background. What I tend to do now is focus on the background on infinity, And then if I can't get my foreground sharp doing that, then I focus stack. Nevertheless, let's see what we can do with this image. And again, it's had nothing done with it other than the profile corrections. So first thing I want to do is crop it to get rid of this bush on the side here, and I think 5:7 crop, like that. Actually, do you know what? This image isn't going to work. Even with the crop that I've put in, the image just feels unbalanced. I got the composition wrong, and I don't think there's any way of fixing that in post-processing. And sometimes the lesson you have to learn is if an image isn't composed properly, you can't do anything with it. Although there are some exceptions, and I'm hoping to prove that in the next one, maybe. Okay, this is the final image, and it's another one taken looking across Ullswater in the Lake District. Again, it was November 2013. And this is one where I've got fixated on foreground interest. And because I'm shooting from quite a high vantage point, I've chosen to include these little islands in the scene as my foreground. But because I'm shooting from high up, that leaves a whole big gap of water here, just dead space that just doesn't work. This one also suffers from the problem that I focused, a third of the way in, so the background is probably a little bit soft. It's perhaps not that drastic that it's a little bit soft, because there is the atmospherics there meant that the background probably wouldn't be completely sharp anyway. I'm going to try to do something with this which is not something I would normally do, and it may go horribly wrong, but I'm going to try it. But first I'm just going to do some basic processing on this. So it's had the chromatic aberration and the lens profile corrections done. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to balance the image. So I'm going to put a gradient filter in on the bottom of the scene, pull the exposure back a bit, and pull the highlights down a bit just to flatten it out, but lift the shadows. I want to keep detail in the island here. And then a new one on the top of the scene, get a bit of an angle. And on that one, again, I'm going to put some dehaze in, but I'm going to lift the exposure and I'm going to lift the shadows, and I'm going to put a little bit of saturation in because there's beautiful colours in there, like that. And then I'm going to take a brush, I'm going to bring the exposure back, the clarity up, my flow at about 40-ish, and I'm going to brush in and just make that sky look a bit darker and more dramatic again, where I've brightened it up. And there are loads of spots there which I suspect were raindrops, because it was still raining when I shot this. So let's get rid of some of those, shall we? Again, this would probably be a job I would go and double check in Photoshop afterwards. Into the basics, let's pop a bit of vibrance in. Actually, maybe lift the overall exposure a fraction, boost the contrast, oops, boost the contrast a little bit. Okay, and for the next bit I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to go into Photoshop to do that. So I'm going to do photo, edit in Photoshop. Okay, so here's my image open in Photoshop, and what I'm going to do, I'll start off by duplicating the layer, which is what I would normally do. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the rectangular marquee tool, and I'm going to select the entire bottom section of the image there, like that. And then by hitting Command J, I've created a duplicate of just that part of the image. Command T would give me the free transform tool. I'm going to bring the opacity on that layer down so that I can see it different to the layer underneath, and I'm just going to drag that layer up like that, maybe across to the left, and maybe just stretch it out a fraction like that. About there. Bring the opacity back up, and then I'm going to put a layer mask in, a black layer mask to hide that layer completely. Hold down the Alt key, Option on a PC, click the mask button, and I get a black mask. Take a white brush, 100% opacity, and I'm just going to brush in that layer like this. That can be pretty rough at the bottom here, but as I get closer up here, I need to start being careful how I brush it in, kind of like that. And because it's water, it's not got any detail in it to show any issues, so I can look there, yeah, it looks fine. I haven't done anything silly around the edges, it still looks natural. Yeah, this might actually work. So now let's crop the image, and I think a 16:9 crop. What I want to do is crop out any of the missing stuff at the bottom. Something like that. Yeah, it does look like it's working. Okay, I'm going to create a layer which has got everything in that I've already done. So Alt Command E creates that merged layer, and then all I'm going to do is pop in, I think, maybe just a touch more vibrance, saturation, just a touch, and I think I'm just going to darken the sky a little bit. So put in a curves layer, pull that back like that, and then I'm going to invert that, so Command I, and then if I take my white brush, and this time I'm going to bring the opacity down to about 50, and I'm just going to brush that in. Sort of adds to the dramatic effect in the sky, like that. Bit darker in that corner there because it's got a bright highlight in, which I'm not so keen on. Yeah, well, what do you know? That's worked. Okay, flatten it down. And that can now be saved back into Lightroom. It's cheating, but it looks kind of okay. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, please consider hitting that thumbs up, giving it a like, sharing it on social media, and of course leave me a comment, let me know what you think. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you very much for watching, and until the next video, bye.